Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, it's great to be with y'all. I'm Jon Traunfeld. I'm a vegetable and fruit specialist with the University of Maryland Extension. And I want to thank Haley and Emily for inviting me to talk with y'all today about cold crops. And I have a little bit of an agenda. These are the topics that I'm going to try to touch on and leave plenty of room or time for questions and answers. And of course, we could spend a whole hour on any one of these topics. So I did want to let you know that if you are interested, you can dig deeper on any of these subjects we'll be kicking around today. We have lots of food gardening information through University of Maryland Extension on our web pages. We have a great Maryland Grows blog that has many food gardening articles. We have a food gardening playlist on our YouTube channel. And anytime you have questions about anything in your garden, yard, landscape, pest questions, you can send them to us through Ask Extension. And you'll find that link on every UME webpage, Ask Extension. And you can attach up to 3 photos. So it's really a nice service, and we'll get an answer back to you, usually within 1 day. All right, so what are these cold crops? Basically, they're food crops in a large plant family, Brassicaceae. And the word cole comes from Latin, caulis for stem. All of the plants we're going to be talking about today have edible stems as well as other plant parts, but the stems are very prominent. These crops are all from Asia Minor and coastal Europe. None of them are native. And they're known by other things. They go by other names like Brassicas. A lot of people will refer to this group that way. And also, this family used to be called Cruciferae, and then it changed to Brassicaceae. So crucifers is another name that people ascribe to this group of plants. And here you can see the reason for that, crucifer for cross. So the sepals of the flowers are, form a cross shape. And this happens to be broccoli rab in flower. And these plants are also very attractive to pollinators and other beneficial insects. They have good nectar sources. And so, when it makes sense, letting them flower is good for our insect populations. Okay, so this is just a list of some of the plants in this family. These are most of the common garden plants that we're going to find that are cold crops. And you can see that 4 of the big species really contain most of the plants that we're most familiar with. But there are others. So, these 4 species are all within the Brassica genus. And then we have others like radish, arugula, horseradish. This family also includes lots of weeds that we're all familiar with, like hairy bittercress that shoots its seeds out in the spring, shepherd's purse, wild mustard, Virginia pepperweed. I learned in putting this talk together that alyssum is also in this family, and it's completely edible as well, which I thought was kind of interesting. The other thing about this family is there's a lot of crossing between species, and that gives rise to a number of subspecies and varieties within these species. So, for example, this Brassica rapa species, all of the crops listed here, turnip, broccoli rab, Chinese cabbage, pak choy or bok choy, they all fall under different subspecies of varieties within Brassica rapa. So it's a very large family, a lot of crossing between species. And so it means there's a big, beautiful world of brassicas out there. Beyond the ones maybe that our parents grew, we see over the last 30 years a huge influx of new options for us as gardeners. A lot of the newer plants, I'm talking about the last 30 years, are Asian origin. And Kitazawa, if people aren't familiar with it, is one of the really old, very good Asian seed companies that's still in existence. Offers a wide variety of brassicas, but even within our more traditional seed companies, this is Southern Exposure Seed Exchange in Virginia, and they've been carrying a number of different Asian brassicas. These are two that happen to be Chinese cabbage crops. They're loose head Chinese cabbage plants. They grow best in cool season and during the spring and fall. But they're very good in the garden. I've grown them for a number of years. There are others. One some folks may be familiar with, Komatsuna, which is a very leafy brassica that can actually take some heat. So it's a good one to grow through the summer. And here's an example of a turnip. I grew up growing white globe purple top, and I discovered some of these nice, slightly smaller Japanese and Korean turnips. This is Kohlrabi, which in 35 to 40 days, you get some really nice 3-inch turnips. So just, a lot of variety out there to check out. So before, we get looking at specific tips and how to grow these crops, I just wanted to share a little background. Another thing that's come about that I think is really interesting is the Heirloom Collard Project. So if you're into collards, and I know kale was the big, brassica for many years, but there's this interesting project to try to conserve and reintroduce a lot of good Southern collard cultivars and get them better known among gardeners and farmers and chefs. So you can check that out if you're interested in collards, and you can try some new ones. And I did want to just mention this Brassica Cookbook. There are lots of vegetable cookbooks, but this is the only one on brassicas that I'm aware of. It came out in 2014, and I'm sure everything in this book plus is online in lots of different forms. But this book is a very solid Brassica cookbook, lots of good recipes and information. I think it came out in 2014. Okay, so before we get into these plants, I did want to just throw this slide up here to remind folks that climate change is having a big effect on our gardens. And we can see this in lots of our crops. High day and evening temperatures in particular are very stressful to plants. And we're seeing problems in some cases with fruiting crops like bean, tomato, pepper, reduced pollination, fruits dropping, not forming or being deformed. Not as big a problem for brassicas because the whole family is edible, but we're not that interested in the flowers and the fruits as we are with squash and tomato and bean. We're also seeing increasing CO2 levels, which is favoring weeds over our food crops. So I think probably people are noticing that the weeds can get out of hand pretty easily, and it's something we have to really stay on top of. There's just a greater increased risk to our crops from extreme events, whether that's hail or 3-inch hard rains. And we're also seeing in some cases increases in insect disease and weed pressure. And of course, that is going to vary based on a lot of factors. But the fact that the temperatures are warmer, we're going to have more precipitation in the mid-Atlantic. So these increases in insects, weeds, and diseases can be expected to some degree. Okay, so let's take a look at these cold crops and what are they all about? Well, they are cool season crops largely. They're going to make their best growth, most of them, between 45 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, but they really can be grown year round in many cases. And I'll show some examples of that. They're mostly biennials, although radish and arugula are annual plants. But although they're mostly biennial plants, so plants with a 2-year life cycle, we treat them as annuals, right? We plant them in the spring or the fall, but we don't expect them to actually live through one whole year. So treat it as annuals. All plant parts are edible. And there's a wide range of flavors. If you've been growing these crops, you're well aware of that. Here's kohlrabi, which has a pretty unique flavor. This is the enlarged stem or stem tuber, and it grows best in spring and fall. But like the other brassicas, not only can we eat this tuber, and that's what we're really going for when we plant kohlrabi, but we can also use these succulent stems and the leaves as well. And this, all vegetables are nutrient dense. And I've been told by my nutrition colleagues in Extension, don't call anything a superfood. And, really, we want people to eat their colors and eat a wide variety of vegetables. But this family is quite high in vitamins, minerals, and phytochemicals. So spring is here and we're ready to get out there. If people haven't already started planting on the shore. One nice thing about this family, all the crops germinate rapidly. Once soil temperatures are around 45, and inside within 2 days, we can get seeds to germinate if we're growing transplants under lights. Typically, we're direct sowing the leafy types of brassicas. So this time of year, we're thinking about radish and we'll be planting kale and collards and arugula, but we can also grow those plants as transplants inside and get them outdoors that way. And that can really help you make more efficient use of your garden space when you've got little plants ready to go in the location where you want them, rather than going out. Maybe some of you have had the experience in March or April trying to thin rows of overseeded, or heavily seeded radishes or any other brassica, and trying to, pick out and thin out the plant. So going out with transplants is really a way to make your garden more productive. And then with the longer season brassicas, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, and Brussels sprouts, we're typically using transplants. And here you can see arugula plants ready to go outside. They've been grown indoors. And then more arugula plants. In this case, these were grown in a half milk jug inside under lights. And they can be planted outside, but it looks like they're also ready to be harvested to eat at the dinner table. Okay, broccoli is one of the most popular brassicas. And here we could see, this is probably, I think it was about early June. We've got a nice head of broccoli, but notice we're seeing some separation of the florets, some spaces, and they're beginning to yellow. So it's really time to cut that head. And if we can, do that, we'll be able to, as you can see in the right side photo here, the main head was cut out and side shoots form right below that cut, which is what we would expect. And we're going to get some mini heads of broccoli from these side shoots. Now, this is in the best case scenario, this is going to happen. We're going to really need to keep those plants well watered and fertilized and hope that we don't get a horrendous heat wave which will cause these plants just to go to seed. So what I really want to stress here is that there are real challenges to growing broccoli in the spring of the year. And for most farmers in Maryland, at least I'll speak for Central Maryland, the money crop is the fall crop. In the spring, weather quickly heats up so that in June, if we get a little bit of a heat wave, we get bolting, we get separation of the florets here in the broccoli. On the right side, the cauliflower, the individual curds in the head will separate, they'll discolor, and the crop is basically ruined. So it's not only hot weather and unpredictable weather, but it's also the quality of the transplants that we put out. It's if you're not growing your own, frequently you'll go to a garden center and you'll find transplants that maybe have been growing for 8 to 10 weeks. And it may be a nice looking plant up top, but it's been growing in a little tiny cell. And if you pop that plant out, the roots are growing around and around. So these stress plants are more likely to respond negatively when we hit a heat wave. Also, young Brassica transplants are very susceptible to cold stress. If you put out a nice transplant too early in the season, in March, say, we get a lot of temperatures in the 40s. That will also stress the plant and cause small heads, bolting, and other problems. So it's a real challenge. These are just some tips. If you are going to try spring broccoli and cauliflower, I would suggest trying to grow your own or get with a local greenhouse that's growing high quality plants. This plant shouldn't be more than 4 to 6 weeks old, and they should only have about 4 to 5 true leaves. You should try to harden those plants, expose them to temperatures in the 50s for about a week, and don't plant too early. Over here on this side of the shore, I'm assuming a lot of people are on the Eastern Shore because that's where Haley and Emily are. That may not be true, but for Central Maryland, I recommend early April for planting. And regarding Brussels sprouts, when you go to the garden center, the Brussels sprouts plants are right there with cabbage, broccoli, and cauliflower in March and April. And that's not when we want to be planting Brussels sprouts. Those plants should really go out no earlier than mid-June, at least in Central Maryland, because we want to be working with the season. We want those plants producing the sprouts closer to the first frost of fall. Okay, just wanted to mention that brassicas grow really well in raised beds. I know a lot of people like raised beds. By increasing the depth of soil, we're increasing the effective rooting depth of these plants. They like high organic matter soil. With raised beds, we're not stepping in the soil and compacting it. So we're really creating some very good conditions for all of our garden plants. And, brassicas here in this photo, this is in the fall of the year, growing very nicely in a raised bed. So a couple of fertilizing tips and watering tips for brassicas. This group of garden plants do use nutrients at a moderate to heavy level. And nitrogen is going to be the nutrient that's most often in short supply. So what are we going to do? Well, we want to fertilize according to soil test results and the needs of our plants. For the spring crops, even if your soil is in pretty good shape and you've been adding organic matter, it's not a bad practice to fertilize with a soluble fertilizer that has nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That makes it a complete fertilizer. That'll get the plants off to a faster start. Organic matter is very important, and it does provide a reservoir of slow release nutrients. And if you get your soil organic matter level up to above 5%, you're going to have most of the nitrogen you need over the season. So, the estimation is for each 1% of soil organic matter that your soil contains, it's going to release 1/2 to 1 pound of plant available nitrogen during that growing season. So this is another reason, if you haven't gotten your soil tested, to do that, because you'll find out what your organic matter level is. Here's the thing. A lot of this release happens when soil temperatures are highest in midsummer. So in March, April, and even May, the soil microorganisms that help convert that organic matter, or the nutrients in that organic matter into a form that plants can use, they're not all fired up yet. And so that's why it is a good idea to fertilize early to get those plants off to a good start. And then regarding water, these plants are very succulent. We are using the leaves, the stems, and to maintain that high level of succulence and good eating texture, we really want to make sure that we're maintaining, a decent level of soil moisture. So make sure you're irrigating when rainfall is not sufficient. And I did want to just point out, so there's a shot of compost here that's been applied to the soil. And it takes about 8.5 cubic feet of compost to cover 100 square feet with 1 inch of compost. And that would be a good amount to add each year. And, people, I'm sure, have other ways they add organic matter. If you're pulling out one crop and then planting a new brassica crop, it's nice if you have the compost on hand to also, spread it across the planting area. I want to really highlight row covers because they are enormously helpful with brassicas. This is a material that's been around for a long time. A lot of farmers and gardeners use it. It's a polyester material. It's very gauzy, and it basically covers a crop. It can float on top, and you leave enough slack so the crop can just push it up. It's very lightweight. You can also lay it over hoops, wire hoops, or PVC hoops. But the great thing about row covers is that they can exclude pests, and that means everything from groundhogs to harlequin bugs. And they also create a better growing environment underneath. So in the spring and fall of the year, we're going to get a little increase in temperature and humidity, which can really boost plant growth considerably. The material can be reused. In these photos, what you're seeing is a lightweight row cover. It's going to allow about 85% of sunlight to enter. And of course, air and water can also get through. This shot in the lower right here is from a community garden that had a lot of problems with Brassica pests. And a lot of the folks in the garden started adopting row covers, and they've just had tremendous success ever since. So if you haven't tried them out, they can really work very well. Okay, so just a couple of words on spacing and harvesting. There are lots of different ways to grow brassicas. For the leafy brassicas, we can space them out so that they can produce mature plants, which can produce quite a bit of food. Or we can plant them more closely together, like in this case, red Russian kale. And this is an Asian mustard called red giant. So these plants are spaced maybe 3 or 4 inches apart. And we're not trying to get one big mature plant. We're trying to grow baby greens. So we can come through with scissors, cut these plants when they reach 6 to 8 inches in height, and then they will regrow and they'll produce again and again, maybe 2 or even 3 more cuttings worth. So that's one way to go. We can also, of course, space our plants so that we get full-size mature plants. This is Tuscan kale. It's also called palm tree kale and lacinato kale. It's very nice. It's got wrinkly leaves. And here we can see they're spaced maybe 1.5 to 2 feet apart. It doesn't look like this gardener's done any harvesting. This is a garden, community garden in Baltimore, same variety. And you can see the lower leaves have been harvested continuously. Now, this was taken, this photo, in late July. And this is, in a full sun location in the city, but the plants are still growing strong. And I would attribute that in part to really good care. So they've got these water lines in, they're keeping these plants well watered and fertilized and removing those bottom leaves, as a way to harvest. A couple of other tips on spacing and, plant positioning. So instead of 2 rows of cabbage that are separated by a 2 or 3 foot walkway, we can plant a wide bed of a double staggered row. So you can see how these plants are kind of staggered, not perfectly, but we're going to get a higher plant population in the same given area in this way than we would if we had 2 separate rows. We can also interplant around some of these larger brassicas, these cold crops like broccoli and cabbage. This space between the plants would be wasted for 6 weeks. But in this case, the gardener has come in, planted different types of leaf lettuces, which, is a great idea, great way to use that space. And, referring back to climate change, here we've got mustard greens, which are, can be iffy in the summer. They're not as tough as collards, they're not as heat tolerant. So here they're planted on the north side of some tomato plants where they'll get some shade and can grow much more happily. Okay, so I can't read the top of the slide, but we'll see fall crops. One of the upsides of climate change is that our fall season is lengthening. We can also overwinter certain crops much more easily than we could 20, 30 years ago. So brassicas in particular do really well. In the fall, we can plant them so we're harvesting before and after frost. We can overwinter a number of different crops. And the best way to do this is with the row cover material and or plastic, clear plastic. So just a couple of tips. I know this is spring and we want to focus on spring, but actually when you think about it, after a lot of people start harvesting tomatoes in July, it's really time to start thinking about that fall garden. So I'll just throw a few tips up here to think about. The fall crop does mature more slowly. It grows more slowly because light is going to be reduced as we move into the fall and temperatures are declining. So to compensate for that, it's good to add 10 days to your sowing time or your transplant time. Actually do that 10 days earlier. Again, fall broccoli and cauliflower is going to do a lot better than the spring crop. So if you're interested, you really need to think about having transplants ready early to mid-August, at least in central Maryland. This is a situation where you could also plant seeds and just thin those seedlings to the correct spacing. Plant growth pretty much stops when we get below 10 hours of daylight, but that kind of depends on where you are, the soil temperature, the crop, how it's being protected. But we're not going to see much growth during that 2-month period. And you can increase the cold protection for your plants by even doubling up on the row coat. I just want to show you what you can actually accomplish. Ooh, boo, we don't want to see that snow, right? But here we've got, actually this was a Howard County Master Gardener, Kent Phillips, who was growing some Asian greens, including Chinese cabbage, in the fall. So this is November. This was several years ago when we were still getting, decent snow in the winter. And this is March, actually. And he's got plastic cover over his low tunnel and actually had very good production. So these plants overwintered. And once spring conditions allow, the plants really take off under the cover. And one thing we've noticed is this can be done with kale, collards, arugula, cress, corn salad, spinaches, lettuces. They'll all overwinter pretty well. And this is a shot of high tunnels that had both collards and kale growing in them. This is the Greener Garden in Baltimore City. Really nice looking crop that overwintered. And this was just plastic in their high, covering their high tunnel. But you can see how vigorous these plants are. Okay, and I did want to mention container gardens because it's an incredibly popular way of gardening. I think it's increasing every year. It seems to me it's wonderful for people who are starting out gardening, don't have much space for gardening. There's a low barrier for getting into it. It doesn't take a lot of time or money. But I think many experienced gardeners also use containers because they can help us diversify our gardens. We can grow plants closer to our house. Containers, when they're portable, we can move plants to sunnier or shadier locations. So, containers really have a place, I think, for everybody. This Kent Phillips, who I just mentioned, also grew broccoli in the spring in a 5-gallon bucket, which really blew my mind. And he did it by just paying attention, keeping them watered and fertilized. So that shows you what you can do in a container. And there are lots of options. This is the University of Maryland salad table. So this is a do-it-yourself kind of container. We've got information on our website about that. There are some brassicas growing here, but the whole table could be brassicas. And again, you'd be coming in and cutting plants when they get 6 to 8 inches in height to harvest. The earth box is very popular, self-watering container that works really well. This balcony planter is also self-watering, meaning that there's a reservoir of water that remains in the bottom as long as you keep that reservoir filled. The overflow hole is actually right at the top of the reservoir. So if there's too much water added, it'll come out of that hole, but the reservoir will be maintained in the bottom. And that allows plant roots to dip right into that water. And it really increases plant growth and productivity. Microgreens. Okay, so some people's reaction to seeing a small container of microgreens is, wow, that's really cool. I'd love to grow those. Other gardeners see this and say, what a waste of seed. I'm going to put all that seed in a little container, and this is what I'm going to end up with. So there are really different ways of viewing microgreens. I fall somewhere in the middle, I'd have to say. I don't grow them regularly, but whenever I do, I'm really impressed. So the idea here is we're growing these small plants when we harvest them, and that's by cutting right at the soil line. We're harvesting the stem, the cotyledons, and the true leaves that have just emerged. So the cool thing about doing this with brassicas is there's such a wide range of flavors, colors, and types that it's a really great addition to a microgreen mix. It's very popular with chefs. So what can you do with them? I've used them as a garnish, put them in an omelet, pasta dishes, and a sandwich. They're very versatile. One thing I want to point out is University of Maryland researchers have been on the leading edge of really looking at the nutritional content of microgreens. And this is a recent paper that they published. And what's been known for some time is that microgreens are higher on a dry weight basis than their mature counterparts. So the phytochemicals, vitamins in these microgreens are much greater, actually, statistically greater than what you would find in these, the plants that are more mature of the same type. So just something to think about. All right, let's look at some of the pest problems that this family has. So I'll just talk about a few of them. These are the most frequent insect pests. I did want to mention cold crops in general have pretty waxy leaves. And so if you are applying any kind of pesticide, you might want to use some kind of spreader sticker to get it to stick to the leaves. We don't have much trouble, at least home gardeners don't seem to have a lot of trouble with diseases. There are a number of them. Farmers, battle these diseases. So you may encounter them at some point. If you're interested in looking for disease-resistant varieties, this Cornell has a really nice web page. If you just type in, these words, you'll find it, and they keep it updated. It's actually the only one and the best one that I've seen out there, so it's worth bookmarking. So just talk briefly about some of these pests. Cabbage worms. It's a generic term for a group of caterpillars that all feed on all members of the cold crop group. And so that's imported cabbage worm, cabbage looper, diamondback moth, cross-striped caterpillar. This diamondback moth actually has become a bigger problem for commercial growers in the state. And part of that, the reason for that is this species has become resistant to some commonly used insecticides, including, unfortunately, BT, which a lot of organic gardeners will recognize has been a long-standing, fallback kind of organic insecticide. It's a microbial insecticide, and so it may not only be losing its effectiveness for diamondback moth, but for other caterpillars. So all of these caterpillars overwinter in and around our gardens. There are multiple generations each year, and they feed on all parts of the plant. The row covers that I mentioned are very effective at excluding them, and you can also, of course, hand pick the insects. I just wanted to share one species because it's probably the most prevalent. That's the imported cabbage worm. A lot of people have seen the butterflies. You may see them all summer long if you're unfortunate. And this is an early instar larva, and you can see the mouth parts are so small that they can't even chew all the way through the leaf. So only the top of the leaf has been scraped. And then here you can see the pellets, the fecal pellets. So these droppings are very prominent, and it's a sure sign that you've got a caterpillar problem when you see those on and under your plants. So here's a later stage larva, larger mouth parts and larger holes chewed. And here's something I'll bet people have seen if you grow these crops. So it looks like something fuzzy on the undersides of the leaves. And what we're looking at are actually cocoons that have been spun by a late stage larva of a little non-stinging wasp that laid its eggs in a living, healthy cabbage worm. And so the maggots hatch out inside the worm, they feed, and to pupate into an adult, they spin these cocoons. And you can see the little holes at the top. So the adult wasp, the second generation, have actually cut holes in the cocoons in the tops, and they've flown the coop. So if we were to pull this back, we would see a desiccated cabbage worm. So this is Mother Nature, doing some work for us. And this is biological control. So something you may notice in your garden. Flea beetles. There are several species that attack different garden crops like sweet corn, eggplant. There's a crucifer flea beetle that can be pretty tough, especially on our later brassicas. So anything planted or growing later in the summer and into the fall. And this is, again, a good reason to use row covers to keep flea beetles from getting to your crops. Harlequin bug can be the major pest for folks growing cold crops. You probably recognize this bug. So it's got piercing, sucking mouth parts. And you can see these little white stipples in here. It's more noticeable. So that's what happens, the symptom of the feeding of this bug. You'll see these little spots or blotches. And that's where, the plant cells have been removed and they discolor. So the populations can build up rapidly. It's really important to keep this pest under control, from the get-go early in the spring. And one way to do that is just scout your plants every day. Look at the upper side, the undersides of the leaves. You'll probably, if you have this pest in your garden, you'll see these egg masses. They're very distinctive and they can be picked off, and removed from the garden. So the key is early season monitoring, hand picking, and using row covers. And I just want to emphasize again how important these row covers are. This one's supported by number 9 wire, which can be easily bent into a bow. And you can see how we can use different materials to hold the row cover right to the soil. And on the left is something I want people to just be aware of. If you haven't seen this material in gardening catalogs, it's called micro mesh, and it is got some real advantages over row covers in that the air temperature won't increase underneath. We can get a heat buildup under these row covers, which can be a problem for plants midsummer. This micro mesh can exclude very small insects and you don't get the temperature buildup. I just wanted to let folks know that this may be due directly to climate change. We really don't know, but whitefly never was really a big problem in central Maryland, outside in gardens, in the fall and over the winter for sure. And this was a photo a coworker took of her kale, December 23rd. This was a few years ago, but unfortunately she had covered her kale with a row cover. There was already a population of whitefly underneath. And so they had wonderful protected, conditions to continue to grow and became a real problem. So just keep an eye out for pests, living longer, going through additional generations because of the warmer weather. Just wanted to let people know this is a pest that has not gotten to Maryland, but the end of 2020, it was found in northern Pennsylvania. So this is the Swede midge. It came over from Europe, made its way down through New England, New York. And, unless it doesn't like Maryland, it very well may end up here. And it can be a serious pest of cold crops. The maggots, so it's a type of fly, and the maggots can feed on all parts of the plant and cause distortion and really ruin a crop. So just something to think about. If you happen to notice this, certainly let the county educator in your county know about it or contact us. And I want to just throw in a few spring food gardening tips, general tips. So if you've been out in your garden, you may have seen a few weeds. I think they were worse this year because of the really warm fall that we had. And I swore I would get out there and do something about it. I never did. And so what happened, I was on my hands and knees for almost 2 hours cleaning out my garlic bed. I couldn't even do it very well with a hoe. I had to get down, to get all those weeds out. But that would be a good thing to do ASAP. Don't start things too early, folks. I know there's a temptation to get those tomato plants started. And what happens is you end up with, a 2-foot tall tomato plant in your basement, and you have to keep potting it up into larger containers. Tomatoes under fluorescent light at 68, 70 degrees inside, it only needs 5 or 6 weeks. And you'll get a nice stocky plant ready to go out, when it's time. So same thing with direct seeding, bean seeds or planting potato pieces. People like to do that around St. Patrick's Day. And oftentimes you end up with just rotted seed pieces. So don't rush the season, watch the weather. That's the best thing I can, suggest. Look at the long-term forecast. There, if you're interested in looking at soil temperatures, Syngenta, which is a big chemical company and seed company, they actually have, I think it's called Greencast Online, is the name of the website. They actually report soil temperatures based on your zip code. So it's pretty handy to use. Maybe we can put that in the chat later. So watch the weather, long-term forecast, cover plants as needed. It's a good time to get out there and, thin out your blueberries. Renewal pruning this time of year is really important. Get those old canes that aren't producing much. They've got the exfoliating bark and they're bleached out looking. Prune them out so that the newer growth can rejuvenate the plant. And I got a shout out to winter sowing. We had 3 different webinars this year in extension on winter sowing, and people went wild. This is something I just learned about really last year, I think. It's a great way to start right now, flower seeds and some vegetable seeds. This is a shot from last April. Red Russian kale growing in a milk jug. So, we're just cutting it in half and using it as a mini greenhouse, but outside, so we don't have to mess with lights and, watering and, worrying a lot about those plants. These plants really take care of themselves. There's a lot of information about winter sowing. I think the last thing I wanted to mention was, as far as a spring tip, we all see so many alarming symptoms in our plants in the spring. And immediately our thoughts go to, insects and diseases. But really, most of these symptoms are caused by environmental conditions. Think about the temperatures from yesterday to what we have today, and then tomorrow. And through March and April, we'll see 30 and 40 degree swings in temperature. We'll see very cold weather, frost, whipping winds, driving rains. And these conditions can be tough on these wimpy, annual plants that have probably been grown in a greenhouse or somebody's basement. The good news is healthy plants that are well tended will grow out of this injury. So don't worry about it. Last thing, I did want to let people know that for the Grow It, Eat It program, which is part of the Master Gardener program around the state of Maryland, this is the year of healthy soil. And so we're really doing a lot of educating around soil. We've got beautiful infographics that Gene Birchfield, who's with our program, produced. So hopefully you'll be learning more about how to take good care of your soil this year. And with that, I think, I would appreciate it if people wouldn't mind evaluating today's class. I think Haley's going to put that in the chat. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions.
Okay, John, we had a steady stream of questions basically all throughout your talk. And I mean, some of these you kind of answered, but since they were asked in the chat, I'm going to have you. This first question comes from somebody in Arkansas, which is also zone 7A and B, but it's a little different from Maryland. They're saying it's a little bit warmer, but I've noticed that the zone here is more like on line with Branson, Missouri. And so I've been gardening as if I were there for comparison. And now I'm in Central Maryland. Sorry. I planted my spinach, lettuce, radishes, carrots, and carrots yesterday. Is that the right time?
Well, the spinach, radishes, carrots should be okay, depending, on your exact location. The lettuce, I would really consider covering that with a row cover. That's going to be a lot more tender, so less cold hardy. Alleviating high temperatures using shading. Yeah, right. If you've got plants, an example is peppers. commercial growers are noticing that in the middle of the summer, they're losing flowers and fruits, and it can just be too warm, especially with evening temperatures going up. So shade cloth is something that's really being experimented with by universities and growers. So either using plants to shade other plants or shade cloth is a really good idea to just begin experimenting with, where you're seeing problems with crops that are not tolerant. Let's see, any special challenges regarding brassicas in container gardens or raised garden beds? No, I would just say, pay attention to watering, fertilizing, and, sunlight. So not really any big differences there. Winter sowing for cold crops. Yes, absolutely. I got another class to teach in a month, and I winter sowed a bunch of brassicas over the weekend. So I would definitely try some now. And that way, you've got some nice young plants that can be transplanted in a couple of weeks. Somebody from the Bahamas. Okay, success with collards in the winter. Yeah, shaded greenhouse. I'm sure in zone 10, that probably would be the way. And I would encourage that person to check out the Heirloom Collards project because there may be some varieties that are especially heat tolerant. Broccolini, yeah, I cannot remember what subspecies that's in. I'm assuming it's Brassica oleracea, but I'm not even sure of that. So it's so expensive in the store, right? $2.99, not for a pound, for a little head, and it's very good. It's like Chinese broccoli. So is it the sprouts from the main stem? No, you would actually, I haven't grown it. If it's anything like broccoli rab, you can head it back. You could, because it's probably going to be on one stem. So I would think to plant it fairly close and cut the whole stem when it's time. But if anybody knows more about growing broccolini, maybe they could put that in the chat. But that's one you should definitely try growing because it's so expensive. Fall crops in Maryland, I would say go to our vegetable planting calendar on the extension website for when to plant. Because it's going to vary. And we also have separate plant profiles for all the vegetable crops that gives more specific information on actual time of the season, the month, so to speak, to plant. Soil testing each raised bed. If the soil was pretty similar within the overall area, probably not. I think it would be fine to take subsamples from each of the raised beds and mix them together. Let's see. Oh, Maryland Recycling Center sell compost. So I'm sorry, Haley, I should be actually speaking these questions, right? Because not everybody's reading them. So somebody's asking, what about buying compost at a Maryland county recycling center? Actually, more counties are doing this. So Prince George's County, Howard County, Baltimore County, they do make and sell compost. What I would say is contact your county to see if that's available. If it's not, leaf grow is pretty widely available through big parts of Maryland, and there are other commercial compost, but call your county and find out if they are doing it. Where do I get soil tested? Please go to our website. Just type in soil testing into University of Maryland Extension website, and you'll find all you need to know about how to do it and where to send it and how to interpret the results.
And some of our county offices even have a service where if you drop off your soil sample, we'll have it sent into the lab to get tested. Some of the county offices do that.
Great. That's a great suggestion. Yeah, contact your county office to see if they'll do that for you. Can you tell us where to buy the row covers? It's hard to find them in retail stores, brick and mortar stores. So all vegetable seed companies carry them with their gardening supplies. That's a good place to look. Regarding cut and come again with kales, top the plant or cut separate leaves. You can do either one. I was suggesting to cut the whole top of the plant. I used a half and half topsoil and compost when I made the raised bed to begin with. Now I use blood meal and bone meal to amend my soil when planting in the raised bed, and a seaweed foliar water spray every couple of weeks if needed, along with my drip lines. Is there anything else? That sounds like plenty. You know, you don't want to over fertilize. That could make plants overly tender and more susceptible to some pest. But if what you're, applying seems to be working, that sounds like it's plenty, especially with all the organic matter. Do seeds expired? Yes, I meant to mention this. Another nice thing about Brassica seeds is they have a long shelf life. Really, in most cases, if they're kept dry and cool, they'll last at least 5 years. Other seeds, though, much less. Onion and corn seed, only a year. So it really depends on the type of seed. Tomato seeds, 5 years. Pepper seeds, up to 5 years. What companies have microgreen seeds? A lot of vegetable seed companies do sell special selections for growing microgreens. There are also some companies online that sell all microgreen supplies, including seeds. Cabbage moths don't seem to touch red cabbage in my experience. Is there a reason for that? I had not heard that. If anybody has any thoughts about that, please put that in the chat. That's interesting. For people in Baltimore City, any tips to not attract rodents and rats? We did well last year because we have a dog who likes to stay outside, but what are tips when you don't have a dog? Yeah, I made a salad box for my niece when she lived near Fells Point, and she had rats get into her box, and she ended up putting a hardware cloth like frame over it. So, get with Rat Rub Out, the agency in the city, for help. Keeping the alleys clean of trash is really important. Just trying to prevent rats from setting up residence. Then within your own garden, you can try to construct some kind of fences using hardware cloth, which is colloquially called rat wire. That may be a possibility. There are the cabbage moths that were all over my mint last summer. Could mint serve as a decoy? I hadn't heard that, but if you want to try that, by all means, see what happens. So the thought is, could mint be a decoy plant or a trap plant that would attract cabbage moths over to those plants so that they didn't go to the coal crops? And I don't know, I haven't seen that, but check it out. Let us know if that works. With the pests that overwinter, do they overwinter in the soil? So will they hatch out even under a row cover? Really good question. So most insects, some will actually overwinter underneath the soil in the top few inches. Most of them are going to be right near the top in plant residues. So, dead weeds, dead residues, leaves, whatever. So yes, so number one, getting rid of all the residues is really important, but that doesn't mean that certain pests could not emerge from underneath a row cover. The cabbage worm, I'm really not sure. I don't know if Emily's still on the Zoom, if she would know that, but if you look into that further, like specifically where in the soil do cabbage worms, overwinter, there's probably more detailed information about that. I'm just not sure. Let's see. I had a problem with stink bugs. How can I prevent it from happening again? So stink bugs are one of the toughest groups of pests for commercial farmers to deal with, even when they use synthetic insecticides. The adults are hard to kill. Just being vigilant, hand picking, row cover. The row cover is really the key with the brassicas. The nice thing about the brassicas, we can leave the row cover on really all through their life cycle, the life cycle of the plants, because we're not worried about cross-pollination to produce, fruits. So you can leave the row cover on as long as you want. For other crops, though, that can be a problem. On tomatoes, what I tell folks is just accept a certain level of injury. On tomatoes, you can take a sharp paring knife and actually cut out the damage. Neem oil for moths. Neem oil is okay. It'll probably need to be reapplied. If you can directly hit the young larvae with neem oil, you can get a contact kill. If they feed on the leaves, you get some suppression. I would say a better organic insecticide besides BT would be Spinosid. Spinosid would be better than neem oil, probably. What soil temps are ideal for planting? It depends on what you're planting. For all these cold crops, as long as temperature, the conditions in the soil and weather's okay to get out there, you can plant the brassicas. That they can germinate as low as 45 or maybe even a little lower. Other crops, though, it really depends on the crop. Beans, we'd want to wait till soil temperature was 55. And with squash and melons, even more like 60, 65. What are some ways to keep your plants living longer? That's a good question. And one thing I think it's really important to think about is the fact that all plants have a certain lifespan, and people can get really upset when they see leaves begin to yellow on the bottoms of their annual plants. This is natural. And, those leaves just should be removed. To keep plants going as long as they can, just good care, enough water, keeping the weeds down, making sure the plants have nutrients, but not expecting more than, what the plants can actually deliver. Do row covers help with animal pests? Yes. I have not seen or heard about any deer lifting up the row cover. I would imagine a raccoon would figure it out, but I haven't seen it or heard of it. So they're really good at actually keeping wildlife out. Very, very effective. What is a natural pesticide? So there are a number that things like insecticidal soap and horticultural oil are low risk natural pesticides, and there are some pesticides like neem and pyrethrum and spinosad, that are derived from plants. Spinosad is derived from a soil microorganism. So there are a number of different ones that can be effective. Yes, Spinosid, so that's Spinosad, Spinosad, and it is, it's a metabolite of a soil microorganism, actinomycete. They ferment it, and it was learned that this metabolite was pretty effective. It acts as a nerve poison, actually, on caterpillars, beetles, aphids, other pests. So a lot of conventional farmers use Spinosad because it's a low risk material and you can harvest, right after spraying. And you can find it, it comes different brand names in the store, but look for that active ingredient, Spinosad.
And if
good.
Has a question, at this time, I think it would be fine if you just unmute yourself, or if you want to put it in the chat. Looks like we have some final thoughts here.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah.
With the Spinosad, I'm interested in that. I'm wondering about whether it's been tested to be safe for the birds that eat the dead insects.
I don't want to misspeak because I can't, as I recall, but I would need to check this. And anybody can send me a question directly to my email, jont@umd.edu. I think it is considered very low risk for pollinators, for non-target insects. And regarding birds, I also think it was low risk, but I can't say that for sure. So if you either send me an email or put your email in the chat, then I can check that out. Or if Haley or Emily or anybody else knows for sure.
I don't know for sure, but
Yeah.
I guess as insects and birds have a very different biology.
Right, right.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead.
So I have a raised bed garden, and the row cover. We have had horrible times with all the cabbage worms. Like as soon as you started talking about those, I'm like, they were the bane of my existence for a whole season, and finally I just gave up because we have all natural garden and we don't put any pesticides in. And so I'm wondering if the row coverings would be a solution that we could implement in the, raised bed garden.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Either just, draping it over the bed and leaving enough slack so the plants can push it up. You just have to really make sure there's no way that insects are going to crawl underneath to get in. But the other key is to get it down as soon as you plant. I would even put it down right after seeding. I wouldn't even wait for, the seedlings to emerge. I would put it right over the plants as soon as you put transplants in the ground or you plant your seeds.
Thanks. I'm going to give it a go. We really want to have some broccoli and cauliflower, and that's been holding us back. So thanks.
Sure.
There was a little bit more information just put in the chat about Spinosids. I'm just looking at it. It looks like it was either produced or sponsored by Oregon State University.
Okay. Yeah. NPIC. That's a good site to go to. Oh, good. Somebody put that in the, thank you for doing that, Ray. Yeah, that's where we send people that are looking for more detailed information about any pesticide. Oregon State University has this great service nationwide, and all master gardeners, all gardeners should really know about it. And you can actually, I think, send them individualized questions through their website. So I'm sure they'll have the information.
That's everything. I think we're gonna call it a day.
Good. Well, good luck, everybody. Have a great spring and growing season, the whole growing season. I wish everybody the best of luck.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John. I definitely learned a lot.
Good. You're quite welcome. It was my pleasure.
Bye, everybody.